Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, the Illinois Rural Development Council. My name is Laura Hepkessel. I am the Director of Telehealth Services with the SIU School of Medicine, and I also serve as the Chair of the Board of Directors for Rural Partners. Rural Partners, again, is the State's Rural Development Council. We're a volunteer working board. We are always interested in having more folks engaged. You can join as a member of an organization. I'll include a link to our website in the chat so you can check us out and let us know if you have any questions. We also send out a weekly newsletter, and Ian Silvas actually sends that out for us every Friday. It's short and sweet and gives you some great information about things happening in rural, and we'd be happy to add you to that list as well. Thanks to Extension for hosting this webinar series with Rural Partners. We really appreciate that partnership. A few housekeeping details I'd like to share because we have so many on the line. Please mute your mic, it may already be muted for you, and stop your video for bandwidth issues. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat space, and hopefully there'll be time at the end of the presentation to get to those questions. If you're having audio difficulty, you can post those questions in the chat space and someone will provide technical assistance. The webinar will be recorded and will be available later on the local government education website. If you registered for this webinar in advance, you will get an email from Nancy with a link to the webinar recording as well as a copy of today's slides. If you did not register for today's webinar, but were able to get the login information, please include your email in the chat space so that you can get that email follow-up from Nancy. Again, we appreciate you all being here. We're excited, Rural Partners excited to partner with Extension for this series. I would now like to get into some introductions. So today we're going to hear about a housing toolkit for rural Illinois. JD McClanahan is a Master of Urban Planning graduate from U of I. He's also a planner with Champaign County Regional Planning Commission. I think Zach Kennedy worked with him as well, and we'll come into towards the end of this presentation. Zach is a state specialist with community and economic development with the University of Illinois Extension. So we're excited to hear from JD and Zach today, hear about the housing toolkit that they've worked on. And again, thank you all for being here and hope you enjoy the webinar. JD?
Great, thank you for that introduction, Laura. Yeah, like we were just saying, the goal of this presentation today is to present a housing toolkit for rural Illinois, which is a project that I was fortunate to work on over the last year as a master's student in the urban planning program at U of I and as a graduate assistant for U of I Extension. And fortunately, now that I've graduated, I've been able to stick around the area and continue to work at Champaign County Regional Planning Commission. I listed my current employer, but they did not have a role in this process, but just wanted to kind of list the information about myself. So moving on to the actual content of the toolkit, the goal of the presentation today is both to talk through kind of what we were able to discover in examining rural Illinois and housing issues in rural Illinois, and provide kind of a sneak peek of the toolkit itself and let rural stakeholders know about the resources that are available through the toolkit. So before we dive into the toolkit itself, I just wanted to recognize Zach Kennedy, as Laura previously said, and my academic advisor, Andrew Greenlee, who was my advisor in the master's program at U of I. Both of them were extremely helpful in kind of working on this document and getting it to the place that it is today. So I'm extremely grateful to both of them. Before we dive into the actual content of the toolkit, I wanted to talk quickly about the motivating purpose behind it. So the primary goal of the housing toolkit for rural Illinois, it can be seen in this first bullet point, with the goal of providing stakeholders in rural Illinois, whether they're local government staff, government elected officials, service providers, or just interested citizens, providing these rural stakeholders with the guidance and the resources to address the housing needs in their communities. Another kind of motivating factor within this overarching goal can be seen in the second bullet point, which is just recognizing that rural housing issues are specific to their context. And while there may be some strategies that work great in Chicago and also work great in rural communities, we really want to make sure that that we're not just applying a one-size-fits-all solution and trying to recognize the needs in the context of rural communities. And finally, the last goal that I have listed here was providing a firm foundation and of resources for rural communities. So trying to do as much of the work of gathering data, gathering resources as possible beforehand, so that we can kind of hand over this toolkit to rural communities and they can take it and run with it. I have this term of capacity building here on this slide. And before my graduate studies, I was in AmeriCorps Vista for 2 years. And this term of capacity building is really kind of the overarching motto of that program. The idea of doing work somewhere and then leaving behind a project or leaving behind work that will continue to be useful even after you're gone. So that was really the goal of this, is doing the work here in the extension program at U of I, and then providing it for rural communities for them to use on their own successfully. So with that kind of overarching purpose discussed, let's talk about the structure of the toolkit. As you can see here, there are 5 primary sections of the toolkit itself. The first is a snapshot of housing and demographics in rural Illinois, kind of looking overarching across the state what the situation is in rural Illinois, and then providing 2 different assessments, a local policies and resources assessment for stakeholders to kind of look around their local community and identify local resources, and then a local housing conditions assessment, providing quantitative data to better understand the situation in a specific community. And then with that information established, presenting a wide variety of strategies that could be used given the local context to address housing issues. And finally, developing plans for public engagement and implementation. So taking all of this information that was previously discussed and figuring out the best plan for how to bring in the public and get their feedback and how to actually do something with it and implement it on the ground. So with that said, let's jump into the first section of the document, which was a snapshot of housing and demographics in rural Illinois. If we want to talk about the conditions in rural Illinois, kind of the first question that comes up is what do we mean by rural Illinois? On this slide, I have a few different definitions that can be used in discussing this context. The first 2 on the left are from the Census Bureau. So the furthest to the left is the Census Bureau's designation of rural and urban tracts, with urban tracts basically being areas of a certain population threshold and density, and all of the kind of contiguous areas around those of a certain density. And then metropolitan and non-metropolitan counties, with metropolitan areas being the urban areas from that first map, and all of the counties around them that have significant economic and commuting flows to that county. So those are a couple ways to think of kind of rural and urban, or big city and kind of outlying area dichotomies. But it's also important to recognize the kind of gradations between those, that it's not just a binary situation. There's a lot of different community types. And this last map that on the right here is one example of one way to approach it. And I will zoom in on this category. So these are RUCA codes that are created by the USDA, and RUCA stands for Rural Urban Commuting Area. And this is basically a way to try to kind of add more nuance and more gradation to this idea of rural and urban communities. So as you can see here, having 3 different types of core areas. So metropolitan cores, basically big city cores, micropolitan, so kind of small city, large town cores, and then small town cores. And then around each of these, the areas with high commuting patterns and the areas with still have a significant amount of commuters, but not quite that same level. And then finally, the areas, the kind of outlying areas that don't have significant commuting flows to these core areas. So this is one really useful data set, or one useful categorization to think about the variety of different community types within this kind of rural and urban category. But for the purpose of this toolkit, I was interested in creating a category or a typology that kind of best meets the needs of the toolkit itself. So I was able to create a new typology of rural communities seen here that was able to be applied both, as you can see on the left, to all of the census tracts in Illinois, and as you can see on the right, all of the individual census places within Illinois, which means the cities, towns, villages, and census designated places. So in order to get to this typology, you can kind of see a summary of the process here. So the first step was taking those urban areas from the very first map that we looked at and saying, that's not what we're interested in examining here, and kind of setting those aside so that we can better focus on rural context. And then within the rural context, looking at rural metro areas, so places that are inside these metropolitan counties that have significant commuting patterns to cities, but are kind of outside of the densely developed area and in more outlying and sparsely developed areas of those. Looking at rural cores, so those micropolitan and small town cores that we talked about in the Ruku codes, recognizing kind of the importance of these smaller communities that still have kind of a density and an importance in their region. And then looking at rural peripheries, so the rural areas outside of all these other contexts. And then in addition to these three kind of main categories, the new typology added the element of population change, just recognizing that that change in population can have a significant effect or be a significant indicator of the health of a community and what's going on demographically or economically. So bringing that dynamic in to better distinguish between these types. So again, you can see here just a zoomed in version of the new typology, looking at the tract level for every tract in Illinois, and then the place level. So the main motivation between putting these definitions together for the place level, as we'll look at the strategy section later, I wanted to help provide guidance on what strategies might be most useful to specific communities. So each strategy that is discussed has a little icon that indicates what community type would be most appropriate. So this was really creating this typology of all of the cities and towns and villages in Illinois. The goal was to kind of provide a shorthand to communities of, okay, this is kind of what our situation is right now. What strategies might be most appropriate for this situation? And before we move on past the typology, here you can see a quick summary after these different types were broken up of the kind of current situation in Illinois, that nearly 74% of the state population does live in those urban areas. And then the next highest population percentage is within the rural metro area, followed by rural core, and finally rural periphery as the smallest percentage. One other fact that I'll note while on this slide, you can see here within the rural communities, the rural metro areas are the only one where a higher percentage of the population lives in a growing area than in a shrinking area. So within cores and peripheries, more of that population is located within shrinking areas. So especially with the core and periphery community types, recognizing that dynamic is very important. And then on the right of the slide here, you can just see, as I mentioned earlier, the icons that I created for each community type that are used throughout the document to kind of provide a shorthand or a quick visual clue of what different approaches or what different strategies would be most appropriate for particular communities. With those typologies kind of created, the next step of the snapshot of rural Illinois was kind of diving into all of the data that was available. So on this slide, you can see the 5 different data categories that were examined in this section, looking at population, demographics, health, economics, and housing. And then you can see a variety of different maps showing some of the individual variables within those categories, whether it's labor force or health or other categories. And within this section, as you can see here, there are the maps summarizing kind of showing what the situation is like across the state, and then text discussing the kind of distinctions between rural and urban areas on all these variables, as well as within the different rural community types, what the situation is like and different trends within those. So this is really, again, an attempt to show what the situation is kind of in rural Illinois writ large. And before we move on past this first section, I did want to discuss a few of these overall trends that were observed. So the first trend that we see is that since 2010, rural Illinois census tracts lost population at a rate of 1.2%, while urban Illinois tracts grew slightly at a rate of 0.3%. So again, as I mentioned before, the fact of kind of shrinkage and losing population is a fact of life for many of these communities that kind of is something that needs to be worked with and considered when looking at housing policies. Within the rural categories that I created, like I mentioned on the population slide, rural periphery and rural core areas shrank, while rural metro areas were able to grow in population. Looking at the variety of different variables that I mentioned earlier, like poverty rate, housing costs, et cetera, shrinking communities consistently saw the worst or the most negative results on those economic and housing issues. And looking within the different community types, overall, rural metro areas were able to, you could see the benefit of their proximity to major urban centers, that they had resources coming in that resulted in lower poverty rates and higher home values, while rural core areas consistently saw the lowest values along these. So these kind of historical towns and cities outside of major urban areas consistently saw consistently struggled along these variables. But that wasn't the case universally. There were certainly some variables, as you can see here, working age population and vacancy rates, where rural periphery communities were the ones that kind of saw the most struggles, which makes sense with the isolation of these communities, that the housing stock isn't going to turn around as quickly as in other communities, and it can be hard to recruit labor in these communities. So kind of as a general rule, rural metro communities kind of saw the strongest performance, while rural periphery and rural core areas definitely had more struggles that they were trying to address. And then looking specifically at housing trends, rural areas saw lower housing costs as well as lower rates of housing cost burden than urban communities did. And for those who are not aware, housing cost burden is defined as households spending more than 30% of their monthly income towards housing. So within rural communities, the rate of having to do that was less. However, kind of within rural communities, the situation was not uniform across the board. Renters in rural communities were more than twice as likely as homeowners to be housing cost burdened, to have to pay that significant amount of their income towards housing costs. And finally, the average rural housing unit, so house, apartment, or other type of home, was slightly newer than urban units, or several years newer than urban units. However, as I mentioned previously, there's definitely distinctions between the different rural community types. So I think the rural core, shrinking rural core areas and growing rural metro areas had more than a 25-year difference between the average age of housing units. So again, just emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between these rural community types and acknowledging the kind of specific context that they're facing. So with that kind of overall picture of the situation in rural Illinois, we can kind of move on to the tools that are provided in the document. And the first is the local policies and resources assessment. The idea behind this section of the document was basically to provide like a fillable worksheet or a fillable document that local stakeholders can use to kind of look around their community and assess the resources and different situations that they have that are of interest when thinking about housing policy. So you can see here, looking at housing plans or studies, so like what work has already been conducted or commissioned, if any, in the community to kind of guide housing policy. Looking at government boards and departments, so looking at government staff like the building inspector or the planning department, as well as if there's a like affordable housing committee or similar government institution. Looking at what government facilities are available to kind of pay attention to housing issues. Looking at housing and development policies. So looking at planning and zoning, are apartments or mobile homes allowed in the community? Are they restricted specifically to a very small area, or are they allowed to be built? So looking at kind of the local policies that might be relevant to providing housing. And then the fourth bullet point, housing resources. So looking at whether the community currently had provided housing, LIHTC housing that's been able to be built, Section 8 vouchers that are used in the community. So looking at what resources are already being used in the community and how those can be either doubled down on or kind of used more effectively. And then finally looking at non-governmental housing institutions. So acknowledging the role that financial institutions, realtors, landlords, developers play in providing housing in a community, and really trying to get an idea of who is available in the community that plays that role, and getting an idea of how they could be helpful when thinking about addressing housing issues. So with that kind of local looking around and assessing the situation, the next step is the second assessment, which is local housing conditions. And the idea of this section is to basically aggregate data on the different themes that you can see here. So demographics, economics, housing supply, housing conditions, tenure, and housing prices, and take a look at this kind of quantifiable numerical data to get an idea of what the situation is in the community. So I talked about at the very beginning the idea of building capacity and putting together a toolkit that can be handed over to communities and used kind of independently by these communities. And this section is one place where we really tried to do that. So in order to provide local communities with the opportunity to assess all these different variables, I was able to pull census data and other data for every single community, every single census place, every single community in Illinois, as well as every single county in Illinois, and aggregate it into a spreadsheet that's available online through Google Sheets. And so the document provides a link to that spreadsheet, and as well as instructions on specifically how to find your community and fill out the different variables there. So that really trying to make sure that while data.census.gov can be really useful, it's not the most accessible website. So trying to dive in and gather all that data for communities and kind of present it to them and allow them to see it clearly. And once communities are able to access that Google Sheet and see their kind of local data, they're then able to go through again the kind of fillable worksheet that we've created that that provides them the opportunity to see local conditions and compare it to the statewide average, as well as seeing kind of how their local conditions have changed over time. So basically providing both of these benchmarks to see are there areas where we are kind of significantly above or below the kind of standard condition in Illinois, and is that something that we should note and kind of take consideration of when we're thinking about how to address how to formulate our housing policies. Obviously, if a place has the same like housing cost burden level or poverty level as the Illinois average, that doesn't mean there's no people in poverty, and that's not something to be considered. But it really, having the state as a benchmark is really useful to see the ways that a community might be kind of unique, either in ways that need to be supported a lot more, ways that can be kind of doubled down on and used to their advantage. So with all of that information from those assessments, the next step is thinking about strategies. So what can actually be done to address the housing issues in rural Illinois communities? And the strategy section is divided into the 6 categories that you see here that I'll go more in detail, but we're focusing on land use and zoning, financing assistance, protecting tenants and rental housing, looking at approaches outside of kind of the conventional housing market, looking at preserving the affordable housing that already exists in a community, and looking at how a community can make the most of state and federal funding sources for housing. So the first section, land use and zoning, is kind of focusing on the existing zoning and land use restrictions in a community and how those could be altered or considered to best allow for housing to be built in the community. So that could mean allowing denser housing, so allowing duplexes or apartments to be built, so that those housing types could be built for a cheaper price per unit, and hopefully that lower price would be passed on to the occupants. Looking at similarly reducing parking requirements so that more housing can be built and land doesn't have to be set aside for cars, and similar approaches through the local land use code. I had mentioned at the beginning that we really want to consider kind of local context and what's going on in individual communities when we think about the strategies for housing. And I think this section is one that is really promising. Some communities setting aside a specific amount of local money in order to fund affordable housing might be kind of a political non-starter, might be a really hard sell. But thinking about how local regulations can be reduced or reframed might be a lot more politically feasible in those communities. So this is kind of one way to approach local housing issues from a variety of perspectives and try to kind of diagnose and address these issues through a variety of different strategies. The next section is focused on financing assistance. So thinking about how local communities can set aside public funds to be used towards housing, and how to structure those funds, and then what that money can actually be used for. So thinking about helping local community members weatherize their home, or helping senior citizens rehabilitate their home for accessibility, or possibly helping public employees with down payment assistance on their home so that they're able to invest in the community and kind of stick around long term, as well as thinking about for manufactured housing, making sure that local financial institutions are familiar with how to write mortgages for manufactured homes, and not just creating kind of the property loans that are common for manufactured homes that get much worse rates, but figuring out the ways to affordably finance manufactured housing. So these are all different ways that a local community can think about how to provide the funding to provide both affordable and safe and quality housing to local community members. And one interesting thing with the financing assistance is just thinking again of the flexibility of accommodating local conditions. So for a lot of these programs, like rehabilitation, weatherization, down payments, some communities might decide that they want to set aside a fund for those, and will just write grants out of the fund and provide significant assistance through a grant to particular community members. Some communities might decide that they don't have the funds to just write grants to local residents, but they can write low interest long-term loans to those residents so that they are able to loan out the money and then get it back over the long term. And then once they get the money back, they're able to use it for a new community member who has similar needs. So thinking about how to structure that financing can accommodate the specific local conditions and the local needs of the community. The next section in the strategies is focused on tenant protections. So thinking about those renters in rural communities that I mentioned earlier, and how they can be accommodated and protected and provided similar levels of safety and stability in their housing that homeowners are able to have. So that can be specific laws that a local community implements to kind of slow the eviction process and give tenants the time and the time to kind of right whatever issues that they have and prevent them from being removed from their housing, as well as laws that can protect tenants who use some of these federal programs like Section 8, ensure that they are able to find housing and aren't discriminated against. Tenant protections could also be setting up, similar to the financing programs that I said earlier, setting up a program where the community is able to write a loan to community members to cover their rent, just to provide that stability so that they can stay on their feet and kind of keep their economic situation stable so that they can continue in the community. Eviction prevention could also mean kind of setting up a program of mediation between landlords and tenants before the eviction process starts, where public employees can work with both sides and try to reach a solution that works for both sides instead of removing people from housing. And finally, thinking about if community members do reach the point where they are removed from their housing, providing homelessness services to help them get back on their feet and back into stable housing. The next section is focused on non-market approaches. So thinking about different strategies for how to address housing needs outside of this kind of the speculative housing and land market. So land banking, putting land in kind of public hands to be saved and used for kind of public interest goals in the future, as well as community land trusts where land is owned by a cooperative and the housing is kind of distributed through that cooperative measure. Both of these are really promising strategies, especially in places where it's clear that the existing speculative housing market has places where it's not meeting needs. So if the housing market in a community has crashed significantly, that might be a place for local government institutions to come in and gather up land and keep it for future uses. Or if there's an area where the land and housing prices are increasing at exponential rates, a community land trust could be very useful in terms of removing land and housing from that speculative market and putting it in a communal trust where the interest is in providing housing and not on increasing land values. The next strategy in the next section in the strategies chapter is focused on affordable housing preservation. So looking at both the existing subsidized housing in a community as well as the existing housing that is affordable or low cost without subsidies, and trying to figure out the best strategies for continuing that affordability. So that could include keeping an inventory of subsidized properties in a community and kind of checking in with their landlords and making sure that there's consistent communication. That could include code enforcement. So being proactive, and if there are issues with housing maintenance, finding ways to address those early to prevent housing from kind of deteriorating too far and being removed from the housing stock, as well as other strategies that you can see here of providing, whether it's tax relief or whether it's financial assistance to homeowners and landlords in affordable housing to kind of make sure that housing continues to stay stay affordable and serve those local needs. And finally, within the strategy section, this last section is focused on state and federal funding sources, and looking at kind of 4 specifically here. These first 2, LIHTC, or the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, and Housing Choice Vouchers, it's very likely that local community that they're already being used in local communities by the housing authority, by renters, or by affordable housing developers. But it can be really useful for local housing stakeholders and the local government to think through how those are being used in the community and how they can be more proactive on facilitating how those are used. And then these last 2 bullet points are kind of 2 larger government programs that would be particularly useful for rural Illinois communities. So the USDA's Rural Development Program, which provides grants and loans for single-family housing, for multifamily housing, for community development, for a variety of needs in rural contexts, as well as the Illinois Housing Development Authority, which is our statewide housing finance agency, and similarly provides a variety of services both to private homeowners or people that want to buy a home, to landlords, to city governments. So kind of going through the variety of programs that both of these government institutions provide and how they could be useful in the rural context. And before we move on past the strategy section, I just wanted to show a quick example of what one of the spreads looks like within that section. So providing, like I said, the community type logos to provide kind of a quick shorthand of what community types this strategy might be particularly relevant for, looking at particular variables from the community assessment that might be an indicator that this strategy would be useful, looking at the kind of details of what this strategy means and how it's implemented, looking at case studies within Illinois and within other contexts of how this strategy has been used previously, and finally looking at resources and model legislation or implementation guidance so that communities have a variety of assistance and resources available if they want to try to approach the strategy at the local level. So with all of that information established, the last section of the document is focused on public engagement and implementation. And like I said at the beginning, really kind of taking all of the information, all of the resources that we've already discussed and trying to figure out how these can actually be applied and used effectively in the local context. So this section is divided into 6 different steps that you can see here. And the idea behind this was kind of providing a framework for communities to use the document. There might be some communities that just decide to flip through the strategy section and say, okay, this strategy looks promising. We might look further into that and not want to go into this multi-step process. That's fine. But if communities are kind of looking into how to approach housing issues locally at the kind of the comprehensive and long-term level, this section was kind of focused on how they could start thinking about that. So first, forming a steering committee of people that are interested in housing locally or in the different housing sectors that we already discussed, and a group that will kind of continue to push the project forward and focus on kind of long-term progress regarding local housing. Step 2, obtaining large-scale and individual level data. So using those 2 assessments that we mentioned earlier, as well as reaching out to local community members through surveys, through open houses and other strategies to kind of get a picture of what the situation is like locally and what struggles local community members are having and what their kind of sentiments towards housing issues are. And this is another section where kind of we tried to do as much as we could to do the work beforehand for local communities. So this section provides a variety of kind of pre-written survey resources so that communities can kind of take those and run with them and administer them locally to kind of most effectively learn about local community needs. The third step is focused on developing strategy recommendations. So taking all the information learned in step 2 and using it to develop ideas of which strategies might be most appropriate to undergo. Step 4, presenting these recommendations to local stakeholders, so to the public at large, as well as elected officials, and kind of taking the temperature of how people feel about these strategies, what their issues might be, which leads to step 5, updating them after stakeholders are able to learn about kind of specific concerns or issues with those strategies, regrouping, updating them, and then moving towards the implementation phase. So whether that's writing a grant application, whether that's passing a local policy, really moving on to the process of implementing the strategy locally. And then finally, step 6 is focused on continued implementation. So recognizing that even if a community is able to pass a particular policy, that's not, everything's not solved immediately. So developing strategies for kind of tracking the results of the strategy that they've been able to use, as well as thinking about, okay, we implemented one strategy. Were there other like lower priority strategies that we also wanted to pursue now that we have that one implemented? So really developing a plan for how to think long-term and continue to grow and address housing issues in their local context. So with that, all of that said, that was kind of a quick whirlwind summary of what can be found in the toolkit. The actual toolkit itself can be found at the following box link that's in the PDF of this presentation. So that will be sent to everyone that attended the presentation today. And there are a few tiny details still being worked out. So that's why it's still on box for the moment. But it will soon be found at the extension website. And my understanding is that extension will be doing some like public outreach and really kind of advertising the toolkit once it's fully available. So attendees of this webinar will have access to the mostly finalized version now, but you should also see more in the immediate future about kind of publicizing this toolkit and making it available for rural communities. And with that, thank you for attending and listening to this presentation. I believe Zach had a few things that he might have wanted to say at the end, as well as possibly offering time for questions. So I will turn it over to Zach, and thank you for attending and listening to the work that we're doing within Extension to address rural housing issues.
Thanks so much, JD. The first thing I really wanted to say is just thank you to you for all the hard work you put in on this project. We really appreciate it, and I think that the product at the end is something excellent that communities can use, and it was really a pleasure to work with you. You're one of the best graduate students we've had, so I really appreciate all your efforts. This is an extension product, so we are willing to work with you, as JD said, as you try this out, implement it. I noticed that one of the comments in the chat space was asking if any communities had piloted this yet. No, you're kind of getting in on the ground floor, but we would love to partner with you as you try out the toolkit. We would appreciate any feedback you might have. That'll just help us make modifications to make the toolkit even better and more user-friendly. And again, you'll have access to it through the follow-up email, and we'll be building a web page on our extension website as well for a permanent home for the toolkit, and doing some of those press releases that JD had mentioned. So I think at this point, maybe we can have our moderators feed us the questions, or I'm not sure how we want to proceed there. But again, JD, thank you so much for all your hard work on this. I could also act as a question moderator if you would like. I'm not sure if Laura was going to do that, or Ann, or I can step up and do that as well.
Sorry, Zach, I am happy to. I wasn't sure who was either. Any strategies to target low supply of homes priced for the middle income tier in small towns?
Yeah, I think thinking about kind of targeting middle income tier, I think the sections within the strategy chapter that would be particularly relevant would be kind of the land use section, as well as the affordable housing preservation section. So I think within within that kind of middle tier of housing provision, whether in rural communities, whether it's allowing apartment development or just allowing kind of smaller lot single family home development, thinking about providing more flexibility on the housing types that are available in a community can do a lot to kind of lessen the cost of land that plays into housing costs and really address those. And then within the kind of affordable housing preservation point that I made, I think there's just the fact that there's only so cheap that kind of brand new housing that's being built is going to be, there's costs of construction that are kind of fairly fixed, but trying to make sure that as new housing is being built, that the existing housing in a community is able to kind of stay intact and remain as quality housing, that can definitely be play an important role in providing that kind of middle housing tier in a community.
Thanks, JD. There's a lot of information to digest today of what you provided, a lot of good things for people to think about. Would your recommendation be that the community use this as a workbook for planning, like work through the workbook section by section as they're thinking about their community?
Yeah, I think, yeah, like I kind of mentioned at the end there, I think the intention is that a community, if they were interested in kind of thinking long-term and thinking comprehensively about addressing their local housing issues, that this definitely could be used as a workbook, that the assessments can be filled out and the community members can kind of follow the steps that I discussed in the final section and kind of go through a process of kind of making sure that they have an understanding of local conditions and that they're doing public outreach, and from there developing their particular strategies that they want to use. So I think ideally, if there is kind of the time and the investment in a local community, I think that's kind of the ideal situation. But again, like I said, the hope is that even if a community is not able to invest kind of that level of time, that they can still flip through the document, kind of use the kind of icons and the different parts of the strategy section to see kind of what might be most relevant to their community and kind of run from there if they need to. So ideally, every community would kind of have the resources to think about this, to put a community together and think about it long term. But that's probably not a feasible expectation. So really trying to put together as many resources as possible for communities to be able to just to kind of flip through it and take it and run with it as they need to do.
Thanks, JD. Here's a longer question. So could the presenter speak to complex county housing issues? The county this person lives in is St. Clair County, which is in the Metro East St. Louis area. Has Belleville, rural areas outside of Mascoutah, Freeburg, Fayetteville, and they also have Scott Air Force Base embedded in the Mascoutah-Shiloh area. Very complex county to evaluate for housing issues. So anything, since that's such a mix? Yeah,
I think one discussion that is talked about within the first kind of that first overarching data section in the document is the potential for communities to kind of partner together. So I could see in St. Clair County definitely recognizing the variety of different conditions that exist. So individual communities that are kind of further from the St. Louis area, or kind of more rural communities, could partner together to kind of pool resources and acknowledge that they kind of have specific situations that they have in common, and work to address the specific situations of the kind of more rural communities within that kind of metro county. I think working at the level of the county government in a lot of these rural contexts is going to be useful, because it's likely to have more resources than individual rural communities might have. But yeah, I think kind of figuring out ways for rural communities within that kind of metro context or within other contexts to kind partner together and try to find ways to combine their resources and make sure that their voices are being heard within kind of the county or the metropolitan level political context, and just kind of partnering to combine those resources, I think would be one of the most ideal situations.
Thanks, JD.
I'd also add that if you, as you're going through the strategy section, pay careful attention to the look into if piece, which is basically describing some conditions you might find in your county. And so as you're reading through those, you can say, yeah, that kind of looks like us. And even though it's a complex area and that different communities may have different issues, you could kind of create a universe of strategies that might apply in the county, and knowing that they might apply more specifically to certain communities than others. But I think that the toolkit is good in the sense that it gives you that look into if piece, so that you have some sort of indicators or benchmarks that you can be looking for to decide whether a particular strategy might work in your county. We do recognize that there's a lot of interrelated complex issues, and that when you're working at a county level, you're going to have communities of different types that are maybe different strategies will be appropriate for. But we hope that we've given enough signposting within the document that you can begin to navigate and decide which strategy might be best for a complex county like that.
Thanks, JD and Zach. JD, in your research and your work, did you come across any less expensive housing alternatives that might have used manufactured homes or anything like that to share?
I think I'm trying to think through the different things that I found. I would say manufactured housing was, I think I touched on it briefly at the strategy section, but that definitely is a strategy that is discussed and as a way to provide affordable housing. And I think within that kind of manufactured housing realm, the one thing that I talked about was making sure that the financing for that housing is kind of all set up as like an actual mortgage to kind of ensure the affordability. So a lot of times, if manufactured housing is in a mobile home park, a lot of times that means that the residents own their unit or their manufactured home, which is the part that depreciates, and they pay rent on the land, which is the part that is actually to likely to appreciate. So the mobile home park structure can be kind of problematic when thinking of affordable housing strategies, but certainly on kind of on private land or on an individual lot, manufactured homes can provide a really useful way to reduce some of the construction costs. And it's really a matter. A lot of times, manufactured housing is, when people get loans for it, it's as a chattel loan as opposed to like a mortgage. So it has much worse interest rates, et cetera, than what an actual mortgage would be. But if it's on a permanent foundation on kind of privately owned land, it should be able to get a mortgage. So that I think working with local financial institutions to make sure that financing is all kind of worked out and they know how to handle that is one way to certainly accommodate that issue. But yeah, I think manufactured housing is absolutely an important component of this. And some of the research that I was able to find did indicate that in a lot of contexts, manufactured housing is able to, it does appreciate at similar rates to kind of stick-built or site-built housing. So it can provide a way to reduce a lot of the upfront construction costs, but still provide some of the benefits of home ownership to the residents. So I would absolutely advocate for manufactured housing as one tool in the toolkit, and would encourage you to check out that section in the document to learn more.
So JD, as we're starting to wrap up, I'm going to ask you one more question. I was going to see if Nancy wanted to go ahead and put the poll question up so people can be answering that. But JD, do you have anything else to share about what you see a role of as an elected official or someone in real estate or in the construction business? Do you see have any suggestions or thoughts on what roles they might play in this conversation?
Yeah, I think people that are working within this housing realm outside of kind of the realm of government or service providers, I think definitely bring a unique knowledge to to this realm, whether it's just like the logistics of like development and how housing is built, or how it's sold and how it moves between hands. So I think, and especially in a lot of rural communities, the planning staff or the elected officials are not likely to have that same level of expertise. So I think just being involved in the housing discussions and being willing to kind of lend the perspective and expertise is definitely an important important tool. I would say on the flip side, of the elected official side, recognizing that realtors or developers might have some of their own interests when they're volunteering their time. So making sure to kind of accept that knowledge and recognize that there is a lot of useful knowledge of the field that comes from those community members, while also kind of trying to balance perspectives and make sure that all the different voices in the community are heard.
I'll just add to that those two groups that Ted has identified, both the elected officials and then also the folks that are involved in real estate and construction, are two of the key groups that we've identified as you'd probably want on your committee if you're going to go through the formal process. We talk about forming a steering committee, and we recommend that you have representatives from both those groups, both elected officials and folks from the real estate industry. Like JD said, they're both going to bring unique perspectives that are relevant to any sort of housing development initiatives that you're going to go forward with. So those would be your key steering committee members.
Absolutely, yeah. I think in that final section about forming the committee, we do kind of provide an idea of what kind of the ideal committee members would look like, and bringing in perspectives from the real estate and construction and development industries, from local government, from kind of local service providers. All of these kind of provide really useful and important perspectives on the issue of housing that can all contribute significantly to kind of addressing those issues locally.
Thanks, JD and Zach. We really appreciate your time today and all the great work that you've put into this toolkit. It's going to be a great resource for communities. I think there's definitely some interest from folks getting their hands on that and using that in their own communities. So thank you again for your time. Thanks to Extension for co-hosting this webinar series with Rural Partners. Again, if you're interested in more information about Rural Partners, included the website in the chat box. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and the recording will be made available via email to those who registered and on the local government education website through Extension. So there's more Extension webinars in the near future, but as far as the Rural Partners Extension series, we're going to take a break in July, pick back up in August with the Rural Economic Development series. We hope you can join us then, and we hope you all have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your summer, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.